So America is building the most expensive factories in its history. It does not have the workers to run them. That is not a projection. That is not a partisan claim. In 2022, the CHIPS and Science Act pledged $39 billion in federal subsidies for semiconductor manufacturing, and it worked. It catalyzed at least $300 billion in private investment. And American fab capacity is on track to triple between 2022 and 2032. The first meaningful expansion of American chip making since the 1980s. And in the same period, the number of Americans working in semiconductor and electronic component manufacturing fell from a peak of roughly 401,000 in 2023 to 368,400 as of March 2026. Read those two facts side by side one more time. $300 billion of factories going up, 33,000 fewer people to work in them. In July of 2026, a joint analysis by McKinsey, the chip industry group SEMI, and the National Science Foundation put a number on where this ends. A skilled labor deficit reaching as much as 157,000 full-time workers by 2030. Most acute in Texas, California, Arizona, New York, and Ohio, which is to say precisely and exclusively in the states where the new factories are being built. TSMC and Intel have both publicly cited shortages of skilled workers as a reason their timelines have slipped. And while that was happening over 13 months in signing rooms in Munich and Brussels and Toronto, Canada quietly wrote itself into somebody else's industrial future. Warren Buffett understood the principle underneath all of this 3 years ago, and he understood it well enough to lose money proving it. In 2022, he bought $4.1 billion of Taiwan Semiconductor. Within roughly 2 quarters, he had sold every share. He never once criticized the company. He told Nikkei that geopolitical tension was certainly a consideration and called TSMC a well-managed company, and then said Berkshire would find other places for its capital. The Oracle of Omaha, 6 decades into evaluating businesses, walked away from the single best-run chipmaker on earth for one reason. Not the management, not the margins, where it was. When you see the 13-month sequence of documents Canada signed, and where the last one was signed, and what was standing empty in Arizona while the ink dried, you'll understand why the question was never who makes the chips. It was who gets to be in the room when the next decade of manufacturing is arranged. Hit subscribe, because this is being decided right now in rooms nobody is covering, and the decisions do not reverse. Let me give you the full context, because this did not begin with semiconductors, and it did not begin in 2026. To understand what Canada has been doing, you have to understand what changed in the relationship first. For roughly 75 years, Canadian industrial strategy rested on a single load-bearing assumption that the United States was not merely the largest market, but a permanent one. Supply chains were built north to south. Auto parts crossed the border 6 and 7 times before a finished vehicle rolled off a line. Defense procurement was integrated. The assumption was so deep it was never articulated, because nobody articulates the floor they are standing on. Then came the tariffs, and the trade conflict, and the repeated public suggestion that the border itself was negotiable. And Ottawa did something that the political coverage almost entirely missed, because it produced no confrontation and generated no viral moment. It went shopping. Here is the sequence, and I want you to watch the dates, because the dates are the story. June 23, 2025, at the Canada-EU Summit, Canada and the European Union sign a security and defense partnership, a framework covering crisis management, military mobility, cyber threats, and defense procurement. At the time this was reported, where it was reported at all, as symbolic, it was not symbolic. It was a foundation being poured. December 2025, Canada and Germany launched the Canada-Germany Digital Alliance. That same month, the EU-Canada Digital Partnership holds its inaugural Digital Partnership Council, producing a joint statement backed by 2 memoranda of understanding. Late that year, Canada and the EU finalized an artificial intelligence cooperation agreement. February 2026. This is the month everything accelerates, and it accelerates in 3 directions at once. On February 14th, Canada signs an agreement with the European Union for participation in the SAFE instrument, SAFE is a €150 billion loan facility supporting joint defense procurement under Europe's Readiness 2030 plan, and Canada became the first and only non-European country granted access to it. Sit with that phrase for a moment. First and only. That same month, at the Munich Security Conference, Canadian Minister Evan Solomon and German Minister Karsten Wildberger signed a joint declaration of intent on artificial intelligence and launched something called the Sovereign Technology Alliance, whose stated purpose is reducing strategic technology dependencies across compute infrastructure, AI research, and talent development. Reducing strategic technology dependencies. That is the official language. Dependencies on whom, exactly, is the question the document does not need to answer. Also in February, Minister Melanie Joly and German Minister Katharina Reike signed a separate declaration expanding cooperation on automotive and battery manufacturing, electric vehicles, hydrogen mobility, and critical minerals. March 5, 2026, in Toronto, U-Trade Commissioner Maro Afovi and Canada's Minister for International Trade Maninder Sidhu launched negotiations for a new Canada Digital Trade Agreement at the 5th meeting of the CETA Joint Committee. June 15, 2026, the Council of the European Union formally concludes the SAFE agreement with Canada. In the announcement, Canada is described as one of the European Union's closest allies, and the arrangement is setting a strong precedent for how the EU can collaborate with key strategic partners. 13 months, 7 instruments: defense financing, digital trade, artificial intelligence, batteries, critical minerals, military mobility, and then, at the end of June, came the last one, and it was signed in a room that tells you more than any of the others. Let me walk you through what actually happened on June 29, 2026, because the setting is the entire point, and almost nobody has remarked on it. The signing did not take place at a summit. There was no bilateral leaders meeting, no joint press availability, no flags arranged behind a podium, no motorcade. It took place on the margins, specifically on the margins of the International Energy Agency's annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency. Consider that. The most strategically consequential technology of the 21st century, the physical substrate of artificial intelligence, of advanced weapons systems, of every automobile and medical device and telecommunications network on Earth, and the document establishing Canadian-German cooperation on it was signed in a side room at a conference about energy efficiency. And the signatories were not the principals, not the Prime Minister, not the Chancellor, not even the Industry Minister or the Economics Minister themselves. Carlos Ledo, Parliamentary Secretary to Canada's Minister of Industry; Stefan Ronhoff, Parliamentary State Secretary at Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy; 2 parliamentary secretaries, in a side room, at an energy conference. Now here is what most people would conclude from that, and here is why it is exactly wrong. The instinct is to read the low-key setting as evidence of low significance. Minor officials, minor document, minor news. That is precisely the inference the setting invites, and it is the inference that has allowed this entire sequence to proceed for 13 months without meaningful attention. But watch what the document actually does. It establishes a framework for policy dialogue on semiconductor priorities. It creates channels for cooperation on investment, on industrial development, on technology, on research. It builds on the February Critical Minerals Declaration and the December Digital Alliance and the Sovereign Technology Alliance launched in Munich. Germany, the announcement notes, is Canada's largest trading partner in the European Union, and both countries leverage CETA to expand digital and industrial trade. This is not a headline. This is plumbing. And plumbing is what actually determines where water goes. The signings that generate photographs are the ones where something is being announced. The signings that generate consequences are the ones where a channel is being opened, where 2 bureaucracies establish who calls whom, on what schedule, about which decisions. 10 years from now, when a German semiconductor firm is deciding where to source gallium or germanium or high-purity silicon, the decision will not be made at a summit. It will be made by a mid-level official who picks up a phone and the number in that official's directory was placed there in a side room in June of 2026 by two men whose names nobody outside their ministries will ever recognize. Now hold that image and put beside it another room, 4,000 miles away. An advanced semiconductor fabrication facility in Arizona. Steel up, shell complete, hundreds of millions of dollars of structure standing in the desert, and inside it, a clean room, an environment engineered to a standard of particulate purity that has almost no parallel in human industry, where a single speck of dust is a defect and the air is exchanged hundreds of times an hour. And that room requires a very particular kind of person to finish. Not general contractors, specialists in cleanroom construction and industry-specific safety standards. Then to install the equipment, technicians trained on intricate lithography systems that cost more than the buildings that house them. Then to run it, process engineers, equipment technicians, quality engineers. Three entirely distinct labor pools, as McKinsey researchers have noted, each with its own shortage and its own causes. TSMC has reported delays in its Arizona production timelines. The reason is not permitting. It is not supply chains. It is not financing. It is finding enough qualified people to install the equipment. And here is the detail that should genuinely alarm anyone who cares about American manufacturing. The average skilled construction worker in the United States is over 50 years old. For every 5 workers leaving that industry, only 1 new entrant replaces them. 5 out, 1 in. That is not a policy failure that can be reversed by an appropriation. That is a demographic curve set in motion decades ago by a generation of American career guidance that treated the skilled trades as what you did if you could not do something else. And the appropriations arrived in 2022. The workers required 40 years of formation that nobody undertook. There is no press conference for that. There is no adversary to blame. There is only a finished building and an empty clean room and a hiring requisition that stays open. But the empty room in Arizona is only the first order consequence. What it does to the rest of the economy is where it starts reaching households. Because a factory that cannot be staffed is a factory that does not produce. And a factory that does not produce does not relieve a shortage. The operating reality right now, according to industry supply chain analysis, semiconductor lead times running around 40 weeks. Automotive microcontrollers and allocation at 26 to 40 weeks. Power semiconductors and power management integrated circuits under sustained pressure. And the assessment is blunt. For manufacturers managing their component sourcing through 2026 and 2027. The CHIPS Act fabs are a future benefit, not a near-term solution. That reality holds for the next 2 to 3 years, regardless of how quickly construction proceeds. Regardless of how quickly construction proceeds. Read that again. The construction is no longer the binding constraint. The people are. Translate 40-week lead times into an American driveway. It means a vehicle assembly line in Michigan or Ohio waiting on a microcontroller that costs a few dollars and gates a $30,000 product. It means appliance manufacturers, medical device makers, and defense contractors bidding against each other for the same allocated parts. It means the higher costs land, as they always land, at the end of the chain. In the retail price paid by a household that has no idea a semiconductor lead time exists. And there is a second consequence, quieter than the supply chain and considerably more painful, that lands directly on the communities that were promised the most. Because every one of these facilities was announced with a number attached. Jobs, thousands of them in specific counties, in states that have spent 40 years watching manufacturing employment leave and not come back. Local officials rezoned land, school districts projected enrollment growth, county commissions approved infrastructure spending against future tax base, families made decisions, stayed, moved, bought, on the strength of an announced number. And announced jobs are not the same thing as filled jobs. A fab that opens 2 years late employs nobody for 2 years. A fab that opens at partial staffing operates at partial output, which means partial payroll, which means the diner and the hardware store and the auto dealership that expanded on the projection are servicing debt against revenue that has not arrived. This is a pattern the 45 to 75 demographic recognizes immediately, because many of them watched the reverse version of it in the 1980s and 1990s. The announced closure, the phased layoff, the town that never recovered. The mechanism running now is the same mechanism running forward, and it is arriving with better intentions and identical arithmetic. And the cruelty of it is that the jobs are real. They exist. They are funded, they are needed, and they pay well. There is simply nobody trained to take them. A 22-year-old in Ohio who chose a 4-year degree in 2022 over an apprenticeship is not unemployed, but they are also not a cleanroom equipment technician and cannot become one in the 18 months the schedule requires. And the workforce numbers are not stabilizing. They are moving the wrong way, from 401,000 in 2023 to 368,400 in March 2026. A 2023 McKinsey survey found that 53% of semiconductor employees were at least somewhat likely to resign within 6 months, up from 40% in 2021. The industry is not only failing to recruit, it is losing people it already has. Partnerships have been launched, chip makers with community colleges, apprenticeship programs, more than 50 community colleges expanding semiconductor programs, $5 billion directed through the National Semiconductor Technology Center for Workforce Development. These are serious efforts by serious people, and by mid-2026 they were still struggling to produce graduates at the scale required, because a technician takes years to train and an engineer takes longer, and no amount of money compresses the calendar. Then, in July of 2026, Taiwan's Minister of Economic Affairs, Kung-Ming Shin, said the quiet part in public. Asked about American expansion, he noted that TSMC has announced 16 fabrication plants and advanced packaging facilities in Taiwan. And then, no matter how many fabs the United States builds in the future, it will not be that many. That is a serving cabinet minister of an allied government stating on the record that the reshoring will not close the gap, which is exactly the judgment Warren Buffett made with his own money 3 years earlier and lost money making. Let me tell you what he actually did, because it is one of the most revealing transactions of his career, and it is almost always described incorrectly. In the third quarter of 2022, Berkshire Hathaway disclosed a position in Taiwan Semiconductor worth roughly $4.1 billion. For Buffett, this was unremarkable in kind, a dominant business, a durable competitive position, exactly the profile he has bought for 60 years. TSMC manufactures something on the order of 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. It is not a leader in its industry. It is the choke point of the modern economy. 1 quarter later, Berkshire had sold 86% of it. By May 15, 2023, the position was gone entirely. $4.1 billion to zero in roughly 2 quarters by a man whose stated favorite holding period is forever. And here is what makes it extraordinary. He never criticized the company, not once. Speaking to Nikkei in April of 2023, he called TSMC a well-managed company and said the geopolitical tension between the United States and China was certainly a consideration in the decision, and that Berkshire would find other places for its capital. At his May 6 meeting, he went further, describing TSMC as one of the best managed and most important companies in the world, and adding that you would be able to say the same thing 5, 10, or 20 years from now. Think carefully about what that combination of statements means. He said, "This is one of the finest businesses on earth. It will still be one of the finest businesses on earth in 20 years, and I do not want to own it." In 60 years of evaluating enterprises, Buffett built his entire method on separating the quality of a business from the noise around it. Ignore the macro. Ignore the headlines. Buy the franchise and hold it. This was the one case where he did the opposite, where he looked at a business he explicitly considered excellent and concluded that a factor entirely outside the business made owning it unacceptable. That factor was geography. The universal principle underneath it is the one this entire story turns on. Where you build a thing is not a detail of the thing. It is a property of the thing. A clean room in Taiwan and an identical clean room in Arizona are not the same asset. and they are not the same asset in Dresden either. The physical location carries the political risk, the labor pool, the alliance structure, and the legal jurisdiction, and none of that appears anywhere on an income statement. Buffett paid $4.1 billion to act on that principle, and by conventional scoring he was wrong. TSMC shares rallied hard afterward, and he left substantial money on the table. He has never disputed it. But the verdict was never about the share price. It was this: even the best managed company on earth can be the wrong thing to own when the ground it stands on changes underneath it. That is what Canada has spent 13 months acting on. And that is what makes the ground now shifting so difficult to shift back. Start with what Canada actually brings to the table, because it is not chips. Canada does not have leading-edge fabs. What it has is upstream, and upstream is where the leverage lives. The Canada-U.S. strategic partnership on raw materials, operational since 2021, positions Canada as a critical supplier of the minerals essential to European aerospace, defense, and green transition industries. The February 2026 declaration with Germany covers critical minerals explicitly, alongside automotive and battery manufacturing. Semiconductors are not made from ideas. They are made from refined materials, and those materials come out of specific ground in specific countries under specific agreements. Now layer the defense dimension, because for anyone who lived through the Cold War, this is the part that should register hardest. Canada is a Five Eyes partner. Canada is a NORAD partner, the binational command that has watched North American airspace since 1958. And in February 2026, Canada became the first and only non-European country with access to a 150 billion euro European defense procurement facility, covering ammunition, drones, air and missile defense systems, and space technologies. Canada has also been a third state participant in EU permanent structured cooperation since 2021, including the Military Mobility Project alongside 25 member states, and the Logistics Hub Project since 2023. Canadian defense firms now have a European procurement channel that does not route through Washington. That channel is not a statement of intent. It is a financing mechanism with money in it. Then the industrial layer, and this is where irreversibility bites. Battery plants, mineral processing facilities, and research partnerships are physical and contractual. A processing facility built to European specification, financed on European terms, feeding European supply chains, does not reorient because an American administration changes its posture. Concrete does not repour. Off-take agreements do not unsign. Engineers who spend 5 years working to European standards do not unlearn them. Then the signal to everyone else, and this is the consequence that compounds fastest. Other allies are watching what Canada did, and more importantly, watching that it cost Canada nothing. Japan is recalculating. South Korea is recalculating. Australia and the United Kingdom are watching a precedent form that the United States can be one partner in industrial strategy rather than the assumption underneath it. The European Council said as much in plain language when it concluded the Canada Agreement, that it sets a strong precedent for how the EU collaborates with strategic partners. And then there is the strategic irony, which is severe enough that it deserves to be stated plainly rather than implied. The entire logic of the CHIPS Act, the reason it passed with bipartisan support in a Congress that agreed on almost nothing, was concentration risk. 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors manufactured on a single island, roughly 100 miles from a country that claims it. Every American weapon system, every data center, every automobile depended on a supply line that a blockade could sever in a week. Reshoring was not industrial policy. It was risk management, and the risk was real, and the diagnosis was correct. The diagnosis was correct. The execution ran into a wall nobody legislated for. And the result is that 4 years and $300 billion later, the concentration has not meaningfully moved. Taiwan's own economic minister said so in July. 16 fabrication and advanced packaging facilities in Taiwan, and no matter how many the United States builds, it will not be that many. The dependency the act existed to reduce persists. And the timeline for reducing it now runs on a workforce curve rather than a construction schedule, which means it runs slower and cannot be accelerated with money. Every strategic competitor watching this drew the same conclusion at the same time, that American industrial capacity is now constrained by something the American government cannot appropriate its way out of. That is a more useful piece of intelligence than any secret, and it was published in a McKinsey study in July for anyone who cared to read it. The choke point stayed exactly where it was. What changed is that everyone now knows how long it will stay there. And the final layer, the one that makes all of the others worse. Every one of these consequences is arriving simultaneously, and each one reduces the leverage available to solve the others. American factories cannot be staffed. So reshoring slows. Reshoring slows, so allies hedge. Allies hedge, so the industrial base that might have supplied American plants attaches itself elsewhere. And an 18-year-old in Ohio deciding this autumn whether to enter a trade or not is quietly the binding constraint on all of it, and no policy instrument reaches that decision in time, which is where this leaves us, and it is not where the headline suggested. Nothing was taken from America. That is the part that should sit heaviest. There was no chip deal that diverted wafers from American factories, no theft, no betrayal, no adversary to point at. Canada signed 7 agreements over 13 months in Munich and Brussels and Toronto in a side room at an energy efficiency conference, and every one of them was public, and almost none of them was covered. And in the same 13 months, America built $300 billion of private investment, capacity on track to triple, the largest expansion of American chip making since the 1980s, and a workforce that fell to 368,400, heading toward a shortfall of as much as 157,000 by 2030, in exactly the 5 states where the buildings are going up. Warren Buffett paid $4.1 billion to learn the principle underneath all of it, and never disputed the cost. The quality of what you build does not save you from where you build it, or from who is standing there when it is finished. He looked at the finest chip maker on earth and declined to own it, not because of anything the company did, but because of ground he could not control. America controlled its ground. It appropriated the money, poured the concrete, and raised the steel. What it did not do across 40 years was raise the people. And a nation can approve $39 billion in a single afternoon. It cannot approve a welder. The buildings in Arizona and Ohio and upstate New York are still going up. The channels opened in Munich and Brussels are already carrying traffic. And every month that a clean room stands finished and empty, somebody else's supply chain quietly arranges itself around the assumption that it always will be. Sourcing note, every figure, date, quotation, and named official is on the record. Neich claim, Neich source, IHN, CHIPS Act 39B subsidies. 300B plus private investment catalyzed capacity to triple 2022. 2032 takes McKinsey Spectrum reckon workforce fell 401,000, 368,408 accurate industry data. 2026 just 157,000 skilled labor deficit by 2030. Acute and TXC AAZ NY ODEX McKinsey plus semi plus NSF joint study. July 2026 just 67,000 unfilled technical engineering roles by 2030. HCA plus Oxford Economics InterNavG. Skilled construction worker over 50, 5 leaving per 1 entering Itch Accurus. 2026 Itch Mosey Intel site skilled worker shortage for timeline slips. Itch Bloomberg Accurus Incent 53% of semiconductor employees likely to resign. Itch McKinsey survey. 2023 Itch lead times billion 40 weeks. Auto MCUs 26, 40 weeks. Fabs future benefit. Not near-term solution 9 Accurus supply chain analysis 9 in Kung-Mingson no matter. How many fabs the U.S. builds? It won't be that many Mersch Taipei times. July 2026 Erxplan Canada. U Security and Defense Partnership. June 23, 2025, Global Affairs Canada, NN Canada Safe Agreement, signed Feb 14, 2026. 150B, first and only non-European country, concluded by Council June 15, 2026, Council of the U, Global Affairs Canada, NN Munich Security Conference Feb 2026. Solomon plus Weilberger AI Declaration, Sovereign Technology Alliance Mass and GovCon Exec, HN Feb 2026, July plus Reich Auto Battery / Critical Minerals Declaration, JetCanada.ca Ulyshland Digital Trade Agreement Negotiations Launch Toronto, March 5, 2026. EFOV plus Siduan European Commission Asian June 29, 30, 2026 Semiconductor Declaration Lato plus Rowenhoff. On margins of EA Annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency JetCanada.ca/EU Monitoring Etching Canada. U Raw Materials Partnership PESCO Third State 2021 Netlog Hubs 2023 Etch Global Affairs Canada Etch and Buffett TSMC. 4.BQ3 22 86% sold. Q4 2022 exited May 15, 2023 JetSec filings /24/7 Wall St. Einstein. Certainly a consideration, well-managed company. Other places for capital H. Buffett to Nikkei. April 2023. H-Sheen, one of the best managed companies and important companies in the world. 5, 10, or 20 years from now, H. Buffett. May 6, 2023 meeting. What is not claimed, there is no binding Canada. U-chip supply deal, and no chips were diverted from U.S. factories. The June 2026 instrument is a joint declaration of intent with Germany, a policy dialogue framework. The script says exactly that and builds the thesis on what the record actually supports. No fabricated quotes, no invented sources, no imagined private rooms,